Vulnerability. This conversation today, I love that every time we bring up vulnerability, how many different perspectives we get on it.
Yeah, well, most of the time when I talk about vulnerability, people assume that I'm speaking about a person being able to be harmed or attacked or something horrible happening. They're open to destruction. They're open to being exposed, and they're not mistaken. They're not off from the vantage point that I work from. And so the way we work at Condor is vulnerability is open with possibility. Now, if I'm open with the possibility to receive love, I'm also open to the possibility of that person stomping all over my heart. It's still vulnerability. I am open with possibility. Just because I'm open to the possibility of being hurt doesn't mean I'm going to be hurt. And so when we look at it from this vantage point, it's open with possibility. And what we do at the Condor Approach is we support people in alchemizing the words and the vibrational quality and the anchors that they have to words into something different that they create for themselves. Now, words have a very significant place in our world as human beings. We put all kinds of energy into words. And if I am taught from when I'm a child how to put a particular vibrational tone on a word, I will carry that. And when somebody else has a different vibrational tone that they attach to that word, they will assume I'm doing the same thing with that word. So I'm pushing that same energetic magic in their direction, but it's not. And so if we don't have a conversation about it and we don't connect in a space where we can actually come into a mutual context, then things can get bumpy. And I think that's what happens with vulnerability is we don't have a very standard mutual context space where we can all speak from the same space and or a similar space. And this is where the challenge comes with vulnerability. And there have been people in Condor that have been very resistant to it because they have a lot of old anchors with vulnerability, meaning somebody's going to come in and stomp all. If I'm open, then somebody's going to hurt me. And so they've anchored the idea that vulnerability is only linked to being hurt. So they don't want to be vulnerable because of the context that they've put on the word. And so what we're doing at Condor is we're supporting people in having a new definition. We're kind of alchemizing. And when we alchemize, we change lead into gold. We turn everything into gold. And so when we take charge of our language and we make it what we want and we communicate that with another person, we can come into a mutual context space. And I think that's where the challenge is with vulnerability.
Yeah, and in the past episode, I think the last two episodes, we talked a lot about safety. We talked a little bit about vulnerability and the seven attributes of violence:
Mm-hmm.
hurt, harm, loss, deficit, death, injury, death, pain.
Mm-hmm.
And what vulnerable, to be vulnerable, open to attack, that's right. If I go outside, I am vulnerable to some things just for being outside. If I enter a relationship, I am now vulnerable to some things. Does that mean I'm open to all attack? No, I've got boundaries with some, just like when I'm inside this apartment building. I'm not vulnerable to some things, but I'm vulnerable to others, perceived or actual. And so, when we loop this in with safety, then it is perceived and then there is actual. And so someone could feel vulnerable just by being seen because in the past they've been harmed. Does that mean I'm going to hurt them? No, but in their nervous system, in their body, to even experience fear would require some feeling of feeling vulnerable or open to hurt, harm, loss, deficit, injury, death, pain. And so this is where one comment from Oyi Sun, he likes to talk a lot about vulnerability, and that's why I love doing the post, because I secretly know he's totally going to go off, and it brings the best conversations. The not having the same context, I think, is the greatest opportunity for people to hear different perspectives, and that it doesn't need to agree. And one of the comments he made is that, well, I call that courage, to step into something, but in order to have courage, you would have to experience fear or some level of vulnerability that is causing you to feel unsafe that would require courage to step through that discomfort. So what do you think?
What do I think about what you just shared or
Yeah.
just vulnerability in general? Yeah, I feel like we have to have that mutual context and it has to be courage. And there's a big safety component when it comes to this. If people are afraid to share their information because they'll be punished or they'll be harmed, or they'll have love taken away, or anything like that, they will not share their information. And anyone who is holding back information, there's a cap on their vulnerability. There's a cap on how open they will be. If it's like, if I share information with you, and every time I share that information with you, you take it and flip it back around and attack me with it, then I might put up a boundary. And that boundary will stop you from getting inside. And so then I have a gate there. And that prevents me from being vulnerable. And I don't think I know there's nothing wrong with a person having a boundary.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have rock solid boundaries and they won't let anything inside. And so that becomes a dysfunctional boundary when there is something that's awesome that can come in. And it's a functional boundary because the person may not feel safe. And so if the person is at the poverty line all the time and they don't feel safe and they're working on a survival space, they're driving a survival complex. And that survival complex is going to come with survival hormones. It's going to come with survival language. It's going to come with survival dynamics, period. And that is going to cause a person to be in a space of dis-ease or borderline dis-ease all the time, for all relationships, for all circumstances. This is what we would call hypervigilance. And you're speaking to somebody who lived a life of hypervigilance all the time. And this brings me to an example of my relationship with my daughter. And, I lied for a good amount of my life. I mean, I dare say most of my life I've lied about things. And that includes lying to my daughter. And there was a point where there was a lot told to me about how terrible of a parent I was by my parent. And I took that on. And I called my daughter up one day. This was after I started doing a lot of work on myself. I called my daughter up one day and I was like, "Hey, Chris, I need to share something with you." And she was like, "What's up?" And I was like, "Well, I want to apologize for being a terrible father." And I just let the floodgates open. And I started telling my daughter all of these things that I had never shared about how horrible of a parent I always thought I was from day one. And I sat there and I cried and I cried and I let all this stuff out. My daughter hung up the phone on me. And I called her back and I was like, "Hey, we got disconnected." And I got back into my woe and my crying and all this. And I started letting all this stuff out. And she hung up on me. And I called her back and I was like, "Are you hanging up on me?" She said, "I don't know who I'm talking to, but I'm not talking to my father. Can I speak to my father, please?" And I was like, "Well, this is your father." And she said, "No, you're not my father because my father did this for me. And my father showed up this way. And my father showed up this way. And my father did this for me and blah, 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 blah." And she started listing off all these things that she believed I was a wonderful parent. And I had no idea. And so if I didn't have the courage to open up the restrictiveness of me expressing to my daughter how horrible of a father I was, I would have never heard from her, maybe, right? I probably would have never heard from her all of these things around how awesome of a father I had been to her whole life. And I was so buried in all of the things and all of the context space of me being a terrible father, I couldn't see otherwise. And so I had associated the word father with something negative. I had associated it with something negative. Not my father, right? I love my father, but me as a daddy. Whenever I heard daddy, whenever I heard somebody else call another person daddy, I got angry because I knew that I was a terrible father according to other people's definition of who I am and what I was doing as my role. And when I spoke to my daughter about this, because it really doesn't matter to anybody else as far as my context of a father, but other than me and my daughter right now, right? It really doesn't matter what anybody else has to say about it. And so what happened in that moment was I got to alchemize my idea of what a father was, of what I was as a father in the moment. And that changed my whole idea. I'm getting goosebumps. My whole context of what it was to be a father. And I could only do that by opening up my gates and letting out this information to my daughter, who I was terrified of her knowing my truth. I was terrified of it. And so what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say, and truthfully, it's vulnerable because she could have been like, "That's right." She could have agreed.
Yep.
She could have said, "Well, here's all the other ways that you were not a good father to me," right? Because that's where the vulnerability truly is you believed that, and it doesn't mean she doesn't have her hurts or woundings or things because of the way she was raised, right? Because of circumstances and situations. So the vulnerability is that you were also opening yourself to, she could have been like, yeah, yeah, and gone for, in the OTT, the oppression trap triangle, as her own victor
Mm-hmm.
and villainize you,
Mm-hmm.
become the victim of you, right? And it goes to show also the type of person Chris has grown into, as a result of her situations as well, and the person that she is in her mother's life and her sister's lives. And she's a really dope person. I love Chris for Chris, regardless of being your daughter. She's someone that I think is a dope person.
She's awesome. I love my daughter. And that conversation opened up our relationship into something completely different than what it was back then. And I really after that conversation, I leaned into a space of, and my daughter, she was in her 20s at that time, right? Yeah. And I leaned into her and I was like, hey, I'd really like to shift our relationship into something other than the dynamics that we've had. And she said, I'd really like that. I'd really like to be able to just talk to you about whatever, and I'd like to be honest with you. And it inspired her to be more open and honest with me. And some of the stuff that she has shared with me has been real grown up stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And like real face to face stuff that a lot of parents that I know will not listen to from their kid. They don't want to hear that stuff. And I'm honored to be one of my daughter's best friends, and people will be like, "Don't, it's not your friend, it's your kid."
I don't
ascribe to that crap.
You have different relationships with different friends all the time.
Right. And so my daughter has been one of my greatest teachers in this world. And if I didn't open up to her that time, the possibility of my relationship being this way would have probably been a lot smaller. Right. I would have had some other entry point into getting to the dynamics of closeness I have with her. That is part of the possibility. But like you were saying, she could have also been like, man, I don't know. You know what?
It's your fault. This is your fault.
And
that's your fault.
And as a matter of fact, I don't ever want to talk to you again. There's all kinds I could make up an unlimited amount of possibilities. But when you open the gate to allow your information out, and you open your gate to allow that other person's feedback and information in, that is vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. There was one moment, she had to have been like 23, had to be like 10 years ago. And I was sitting on the back porch with her, right? And
that was at one of the parties.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. She's smoking a cigarette and she was like, I just don't want my daddy to see you, right? And I go, why? What do you think he would do? She's like, well, I don't know, but he's a fitness guy and I just don't want daddy to see me smoking. And you open the door and you look at her and she looks at you and you grab the cigarette. You take a drag off of it and hand it back to her. I thought her jaw was going to forever be through the deck on the ground, because what you did in that moment was show her you're a real person, and that there's not judgment for the choices. It's that the way that you choose to live your life is not to villainize those things. They're just not in alignment with how you want to live, how you want to fuel your body, what you want as far as longevity. And I saw how that shifted y'all's relationship. Because then it was, she could let go of her fear that you would judge her if she wasn't doing things the way that you do, And so, and if I remember correctly, I even said, like, what do you think he would do? And I was like, he'd probably take that cigarette and pull it and like take a drag just to prove, like it's not a thing. And you did exactly that. And that was such a huge moment. Because by the time I came into her life, she's already an adult. She was already like 21 or so. Mm-hmm. She's 33, going to be 33. Mm-hmm. And so, we had that friendship established far more than like a parent-child dynamic ever would be. Now, grandbabies, those are my grandsons, but that's a different story. And to see how much that shifted how she was carrying and walking around in her body from that one moment. And just watching her face and your face, and also your delight in the shock, like you shocked the absolute everything out of her existence, like on a cellular level. Mm-hmm. She was not expecting that.
Yeah, she wasn't. I don't think she believed you when you were like, oh yeah, he'll probably. I walked out there, grabbed. I saw her hiding.
Yeah, she kind of like.
She was trying to hide it to the side, and I reached down and I grabbed it out of her hand. I took the longest drag. I hadn't had a puff on a cigarette in a while. I took the longest drag out of that cigarette and blew it out like it was so extra. And then I handed it back to her, and her mouth was wide open. She was like, "Daddy." I was like, "Hey."
Sup?
I was like, "Sup." And I just handed it back to her, and we actually had a conversation about that afterwards. And she was like, "Daddy, I didn't know you smoked." I said, "Girl, I used to smoke to stay awake, not awake. Well, I had insomnia. I used to smoke to stay
Because you're
alert.
awake.
I used
Yeah.
to smoke to stay alert because I was groggy, like I was awake but kind of floating around in this weirdness. And the cigarettes, the nicotine would actually bring me into a place of being able to focus. And it was crazy. I used to drive." I used to drive her out to my mother's house in Detroit, and she would be in the back seat sleeping, knocked out, and I would get out of the car and smoke a cigarette and stay outside and metabolize and like the
The smoke to
and ionize
materialize. Yeah.
the smoke off my clothes before I got back in the car, and she never knew. And it was fascinating. And I said, "Did you know that?" And she was like, "I had no idea." I was like, "Well, now you know." I was like, "If there's anything else you want to know, I'm down to share with you." And it's been such a beautiful journey of vulnerability with my daughter, and moving myself into a place where my nervous system knows that it's safe to express with my daughter.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like most of the time with people with vulnerability, it's because their nervous system doesn't know how to navigate the possibilities. And when I get, it's just like when we got together and we had this conversation about being honest and telling the truth and sharing our stories. And my nervous system was like, "Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it." But we did it little by little, little
Mm-hmm.
by little. And then we started to open up into the bigger things. And we saw that we weren't going anywhere. You know, one of the greatest gifts I have is my ability to be honest with you, so that I could rest. You know,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. I think that this is the thing around vulnerability is there's actual vulnerability, there's perceived vulnerability, and that it is such a physical sensation
hmm
that someone can believe they're being honest, but that you can be honest without being vulnerable, and you can be vulnerable without understanding your honesty. What I mean by that is, so here's an example. Back in the early 2000s, so in 2000, I was in a coma from a drug overdose.
hmm
Technically, it was a contaminated batch, but neither here nor there. I ended up in flatlined LDS hospital in Salt Lake City. After that happened, I became a poster child for substance abuse education in the state of Utah. They wanted me to share my story. That took me to national talk shows, the Montel Williams Show, universities, documentaries, newspapers. I mean, it was pretty endless, so much so that I was like sponsored by JetBlue. I could fly wherever I wanted. But the thing was, Todd, is I was sharing my story, and I could cry and access emotions, but it was performative. And it doesn't mean there wasn't emotions to it. But when you say the same thing over and over again, it's like it created this addictive loop to the traumatic circumstance that was in my nervous system. Honestly, the coma was not traumatizing for me because I don't remember anything. What was traumatizing was the year that followed. My short-term memory was jacked. Now what I understand with brain health, it makes sense, but I didn't know those things back then. And I went to a cosmetology school. I couldn't pass the tests, changed to another cosmetology school. So that was far more traumatic, we'll say, because it was like, holy cow, I'm actually not okay after this. That was more what was the traumatizing part, but that's not the interesting part of the story. And so what I realized was people would always say, thank you for being vulnerable when I would go on Montel Williams and when I would go on national talk shows or whatever it was. But I wasn't being vulnerable. To me, it wasn't what I was really feeling because I would go into this state where it was almost like robotic. I'm just like, it was honestly like another form of prostitution. You pay me, I give you an exchange of my energy, and then I sign the check and we leave. You know what I mean? Or I cash the check and we leave. And it's giving a hormonal response in my perspective as well, like a sexual encounter would. You know, it's like we come in, we have this peak experience with peak emotions, and then I leave. But that I didn't actually feel like people were really trying to get to know me or could understand me or even really wanted to. And as time went on, I'll never forget this. I now fast forward 10 years later. I was working for Alex Sharfin doing sales, and I was writing my first book. And this book, I'm going to share my story and, all this stuff. At this point, I was no longer speaking. In 2004, I think it was 2004 when I did my last official as a professional speaker, speaking engagement. And that's a story for another day. There's a reason I stopped. One, I realized I was trying to make up for everything I believed I wasn't. I was trying to make up for everything I thought I'd ever done wrong. I was getting 200 plus emails a day after they were filtered for all of the ones that wanted to either harm me, hurt me, you know, the traumatic, we'll say, trolls, because we didn't have social media back then. And so what I was seeing was all these people being vulnerable with me. My parent's a drug addict. My grandparent, my grandchild, what do I do? Someone help me. And it was like creating this pool of more addiction to sorrow and being activated versus like me being an activist. And so when I started working for Alex Sharfin, and I'm telling him I'm going to write my book about, because I have a crazy story. I know that I have a crazy story, but there are certain parts of the story that are far more interesting to the everyday person. Not a big deal to me. Don't care. They weren't a big deal to me. And so everyone was like, you need to write a book. You need to write a book. So I write a book, tell Alex Sharfin about it because I had won or like earned a meeting with the executive team. And I start getting choked up when they ask, what do you really want to do? I said, I want to inspire people with this book. And I start crying. I had done the first chapter. I had put it in a binder. I'm going to show the executive team all of this stuff. And Alex takes one look at me after the meeting and he goes something to the effect of like, there's nothing vulnerable about this. This is bullshit. He's like, vulnerability isn't tapped into just like that. You went right there. This is something you've done 1,000 times over, or however he worded it. And as hard as it was to hear in that moment, I knew he was right. That wasn't true vulnerability as far as me being open to possibility, because I really wasn't. I was quite closed, actually. And so this is when I started to, at this point, I was like 2 years into working with psychedelics in a therapeutic capacity. And I had started to explore what it was to actually open myself to love, or open myself to kindness, or even trust people to be in the same room as me and not steal my stuff. I did not even perceive having people around was safe, let alone opening up my heart or anything else, right? And so I really wasn't vulnerable because or rather I was so overly vulnerable feeling that I wouldn't let anyone get close to me because I couldn't trust them. I couldn't trust adults. I couldn't trust doctors. I couldn't trust all sorts of people. Again, it's another story for another day, around like medical stuff of why I couldn't trust people. And as time went on, by the time so you and I met in 2010, which is right about the time I first started working for Alex Sharfin. And when we first met, I was about as closed as humanly possible. So even though we met, I knew that you were super hot and super attractive. There was no possibility that I was going to be open. Like if we would have dated in 2010, there's no way I think we would be here today.
I agree. I was pretty closed off myself.
Yeah. And I was very much in the blow it all up, whatever phase. And so that's why we were meant to reconnect in the time that we did, because it would not have worked in 2010. And when we reconnected, and at that point, that was around the time you broke your back, fractured L5S1, couldn't walk. I was in a really good place in my life. So it's like I didn't need anything from you. I didn't need to rescue you or save you because I'd done that in my first marriage. So I was very aware. And also I was very drawn to, so the toxic in me saw the toxic in you.
There's a whole lot of toxic.
Well, and it's that like attracts like, and I thought it was super hot and still and all of that stuff. That's why when people are like, oh, you got to stay away from toxic, I'm like, or lean all the way in.
Lean all the way in and then open it up.
Right. And that's the key thing here is I think that when it comes to vulnerability, we started having the conversations because it's like because it didn't make a difference. If you left, whatever. If I left, whatever. And there was a part of me that wanted to prove, if I was radically honest with you and really open myself up, I think there was a part of me that wanted to prove you couldn't handle it. where it was just like, oh yeah, you think you've seen anything yet, sucker? This is the collective. You have only made it past the front guard of the building. Like, you haven't gone anywhere yet. And so I think there was a part of me that was like, I'm going to be so honest and vulnerable, and the fear of that he could hurt me from my old context, my old understanding, that I could be hurt, but back then I would have said, you hurt me, that that would have proven to me that no one could handle me. And so it was still this like toxic drive for, it's like, you think you're so tough? Oh, you think you're toxic? Oh yeah, I'll show you toxic.
And the term toxic is a relative space. We could
Totally.
do a whole podcast on that. Maybe we could.
Let's put it on the list.
Let's do it.
Well, and that's the thing, right? So it's like when we talk about toxic traits, when anytime someone's like, I want a relationship like you and Ta have, I said, no, you don't. Because you're not even willing to confront people you like right now. And some of the stuff we had to confront within ourselves and each other were things that we did not like. And in past people we didn't like. The thing is there was a level of, I would step forward, you'd step forward. You'd step forward, I'd step forward. We kept showing up in a way that neither one of us had experienced in that way before, or at least it was the time where we could both meet each other in that way. And that was the difference for me.
The idea around confrontation comes up, and confrontation is a very important part of vulnerability. To bring something out to the front, right? Con with front in front of you, right? To bring something in front of you is a very important part of vulnerability. And many people have a synchronization of the word confrontation with something negative, because their confrontation often escalates into conflict.
Right.
And to bring something in front of another person is bringing information, bringing touch, bringing whatever it is, and placing it in front of another person or other people. Now, if you don't like what I've brought, you can express to me, hey, I don't like what you've brought here. And I can say, okay, well, tell me more about what you don't like, or I can completely shut down. I can do all kinds of other things. But if I perceive what you're sharing as an attack on what I've shared, I may shut down. I may put up a boundary. And so that stops the vulnerability space. Part of what I find the most challenge with people with vulnerability is they don't have very clear boundaries with themselves. And so they don't know how to set boundaries. They don't know how to say no, yes. And they also don't have a challenge with being uncomfortable. I have been uncomfortable, I dare say 95% of my life, 99% of my life, I've been uncomfortable. And so I'm very familiar with it. And so part of my exploration with vulnerability was, how much of this discomfort can I lean into so that I can actually see another person and see beyond what I have anchored into certain words or certain dynamics or certain touch patterns, and see if I can alchemize that into something new. And this is where the alchemy comes into place, is where we alchemize this and change it into something different. And so when you come to me with something and you express, and I let that in, even if it's uncomfortable, I might say, hey, can we take a breath for a second? Hey, can I step back a little bit? Hey, I'm feeling this in my body. Is it okay for me to be feeling this? And when you say, yeah, it's okay for you to be feeling this, can I continue? I say, yes, right? And then we continue, and you continue to let out all of the things that are coming through you. And I can stand in my own discomfort. And I can sit here and I can say that you're making me uncomfortable, or I can say that I feel uncomfortable. This is a different space where we start to alchemize the dynamics between us.
Well, and I think this is what really trips a lot of people up, and why the live event, why we do it in person, is so critical here, is whether you want to create social change or change in your family dynamic, it is a person's inability to hold space for themselves when they're feeling vulnerable, and I mean open to attack vulnerable, that ends up in a place that isn't effective. And I say effective as in, if you want to create change in your family or your culture or your community, that is anchored on if or how you hold space for yourself in confrontation. Because this is part of, as a woman in the space, someone that identifies as a woman in the space, I have made it my business to have some of the tougher conversations with men that some of the ways that they were operating could be perceived as villainous or predatory or whatever, because now that makes me vulnerable, especially when it's someone I don't have very much rapport with, for recourse or even retaliation. The thing is, for me, I know where my boundaries lie in how someone can treat me and talk to me. And so if I open up to share with someone, hey, this is what's kind of what I'm hearing. Hey, what's going on with this, right? And they are open to hear from me, then if I come projecting at them or to attack them, the second they feel they're under attack, they're going to shut down and leave.
Right.
That's not going to change anything. And it doesn't ever excuse behavior or make someone's actions, make them not responsible for it. But it's that I know when I stopped trying to be an activist and being activated and looked at what am I trying to do in the world? What am I trying to create? What's the impact? Is what I'm doing being effective for the impact versus the judgment aspect? It changed how I approached it. It changed when I recognized, oh, they're feeling vulnerable and attacked, and me being able to ask, like, what's going on in your body right now? Something just changed. Those are skills. And until those skills are developed, we're not going to change anything.
Nope.
Because all that happens is someone becomes, I'm going to come in and rescue everyone. I'm going to be the victor. I'm going to attack the villain, who's going to send the virtue signal to their community that now this person is the villain. They're going to come for you. And now we have war. And this is something that's being perpetuated in the spiritual space. And again, it's not to, there are no coalitions that everyone could agree on and that would serve everyone, you know? And so when it comes to vulnerability, if it's not that, I guess what I'm really saying here is the practice of knowing when you're feeling vulnerable and what texture it is. Are you feeling vulnerable under attack? Or are you feeling perceived attack because, wow, this piece of information is out and now it's a threat to my finances, to my relationship, to whatever. And in dating you and coming together with you, I mean, we were sharing things from childhood we never told anyone. That felt vulnerable to release that information to someone that could go do something with that information because that happened in the past. Opening my heart to love is still to this day the most terrifying act I've ever done, is really continued to open my heart more to you and my body more to you, because it was like the deeper that the connection has become, then at times it was met by the same dread and fear of like annihilation, you know, and not that it always lives there, but it's this understanding that the deeper someone has access to you, then of course it could ping off more flavors of vulnerability that if you don't have an incredible awareness around it, like both of us tried to blow up this relationship, that if we had not been in dialogue and knew some of our woundings and knew some of the, you know, the kids would say these days, toxic traits or traits that are woundings, then we wouldn't still be together now anyway. And as much as it's always been like easy to be with you, the feelings I have felt because of the depth of safety with you have not always been easy, you know, to really question myself or, until he's done, or, you know, whatever stories could run. I never doubted your love for me. That's never been a thing. So when I hear couples say, you know, being married is hard, I'm like, no, it's not. It's the easiest part of my life is being married to you, being your partner, being your friend, being your wife.
I love you.
It's true. You know, what it's inspired in me has been facing horror and fear, and like the deepest traumas could finally come to the surface to be integrated and worked with because they were safe enough to. And so for me, vulnerability is a practice that takes me understanding what that looks like for me, what the different textures and flavors of my vulnerability is. When I'm feeling vulnerable, like not accepted, I notice I can become sarcastic, over the top, or not putting myself down, but there's a deflecting that I'll witness happen. And that's because the level of self-awareness that vulnerability isn't a thing. It's one way to be. And in psychedelic circles, I watch people start to learn or be modeled that vulnerability means you show emotion, which is not the case. You know, where it's like being vulnerable. Oh, you shared a trauma that happened as a child, and here in this circle, in this community, good job. You did good. You shared a deep trauma and being vulnerable. And I kind of call bullshit on that being vulnerable. Well, I'm going to contrast it with, for me, it's almost like a performative vulnerability because it helps someone fit in for significance
So
versus.
versus
No, go ahead.
that's acting. That's acting.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
Performative.
that's acting, and acting is acting,
Do you
and
think those people fake orgasms?
maybe it's a buffer though. If a
Yeah.
person doesn't feel safe and they come up with it, this is where in the psychedelic communities, right? All these things that we call psychedelic communities in the self-help sectors, in all of this stuff right now, people are talking about imposter syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
And imposter syndrome is a way to cover up that you are terrified of your real information coming out. So you present the way you perceive or the way that you're projecting that somebody else wants you to be. And so you provide that. This is another way of running away from truth.
Mm-hmm.
And we are in our society as at large on this planet, people are very, very adept at running, right? We have fight or flight. When we have the far end of the sympathetic nervous system, the protective spaces that stop us from dying, we have fight and flight. Fight is lean in and attack, right? To fight something away from me. And flight is moving away from something. And many of the times when people are in these spaces where the possibility of vulnerability comes up, they will run away. And there are different ways to run. You can leave the situation. You can be evasive in the situation. Right? You can act, and you can throw up smoke screens, which would be the acting. All of that is a form of flight. This is a very highly developed flight mechanism where people are running away. And so that is a space where if they perceive that they could be vulnerable to attack, they shut down, they
Mm-hmm.
provide a boundary, and they provide not just a boundary, they provide a whole mechanism and dynamic around being dishonest. And we have said this in podcasts in the past. When someone is being dishonest, it's because they're protecting something. They're
Yeah.
protecting information. They're protecting their feelings. They're protecting their family, their money. This is a protective mechanism. And flight is a protective mechanism. I don't blame people for running. I don't blame people for not being vulnerable. This is a skill set that we support people in developing. We support people in developing vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. And that awareness piece, right? Because if someone is feeling that imposter syndrome, like you were talking about, and
Mm-hmm.
yet if you ask them, they'll usually say they're authentic.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be impossible to be authentic if you feel like an imposter. It's almost like being able to strip back down to see what's genuine for you. What is your genuine desire for your life? And then we're going to do a check-in and reflections on each area to see where is my authenticity? Where is my vulnerability? What does that look like? Because part of what, being at the live events that we ask for also is, hey, if you see me do something that seems outside of who I say I am or who I want to be or who I'm growing into being, I want you to say something. If I seem cold or standoffish or anything, I want you to check in with me. It's my invitation because I can't see myself in that way in those moments. And I remember a moment with Wavelength where she came up to me. She didn't say anything and she just opened her arms and I gave her a hug. But those moments, that's what got me back into my body and in my heart for the training. I think it was the morning that you threw the merchandise in the garbage can and it was garbage day. Anyone that was there was really funny. The short version of the story is one of the days for the training, I'd put it all in a garbage bag by the stairs, which is also where I put the garbage for Ta to take it out. And so we get to the training for one of the 5-day trainings. And I was like, hey, where's the bag with all the prizes? He's like, what are you talking about? I was like, it was in a big black garbage bag. And I saw his face. I'm like, no, on garbage day. So when I got back, I was frazzled and, all the things. And that moment with Wavelength, if Wave wouldn't have known I was open to that, would she still have come up? Right? Like, this is where having people around you, they're working in collaboration with you to help you in your authenticity and your vulnerability. Because instead of people coming up with all these ideas of who I am, when I can almost give them the user's manual of like, hey, when I'm not feeling safe, here's what that can look like. And my invitation is for you to bring it to my attention, or here's what you can say. It's even vulnerable to share that information, you know? And so the being able to work with things like the logic ceiling and body mapping, I can tell in my body what's going on, where I'm not feeling safe, when I'm feeling vulnerable, and it's in my body first because I perceive it in my body first. I'll start to feel it maybe if I'm going to get up and speak and it's something that I'm not as familiar with or something emotional is coming up, I start to feel it more in like my upper chest and my throat, around my throat chakra, right? And so there's no way that I would be able to now navigate the tough conversations around racism for myself, like as a white woman in this space, being able to hold space around people that are transphobic, are homophobic, to bridge conversations and open up their minds to other possibilities. If I didn't learn how to navigate that within myself and how to be vulnerable with them and also understand my own boundaries and what I'm willing to tolerate as far as behavior in return, like, I think that's the other thing is like people want to just speak their truth, but they're not actually as interested in being heard, or they don't function, is their effectiveness is they're not being heard because they show up angry, and they'll say that, you know, their anger is their vulnerability. They're showing, you know, their hurt, we'll say, but that it's not necessarily effective. So I think, you know, to rewind and just kind of put a bow on this piece is for vulnerability, without that understanding your intention, what do you want to know, do, be, or understand in your life, in a dynamic, in a situation, in a relationship? Until I continue to bring myself back to that and then look at my vulnerability and look at my genuine desires, and is it authentically coming through from, you know, like nose to tail?
Well, I mean, you know, there can be points where a person starts off in authenticity, and then their limiters will come online. And this is one of the things that I've had to do with some of my one-on-one clients is discuss limiters. There's something poking me in my head here.
It's the tree.
Ah, okay. There's there are limiters that that come online when a person feels like they may be sharing too much. There may be a judgment coming online. So
And people will say that to you too. Like, whoa, that's too much.
not everybody will. Some
Yeah.
people will just go into, they'll start off and then they'll start to get a response from people, and then they'll go down the deep end and make something up.
Yeah.
And that can be a space that gets in the way of a person really understanding a storyline.
What do you mean they'll make something up?
They'll make something up. Like it'll be like, okay, you know, when I was a kid, you know, there was one cousin touching me, but it was five, right? And so they'll kind of trickle the information out, and then if they're afraid of judgment, they'll cut off
Or make it grander.
or make the situation with the one person this big grand scheme when there's a lot of other things that are there, but they can't get all the information out because it may overwhelm their nervous system. So they have limiters,
Got
and
it.
those limiters will keep a person safe. And so this is where understanding your own limiters and where your limiters are. When I'm coaching people and I tell people, hey, listen, let's talk about honesty. Let's talk about honesty, and let's talk about lies, and let's talk about what lies are. And if you ever lie or you're ever dishonest with me, and you come to me later on and you have more information that you didn't share and you share it with me, I want you to know that there's not going to be a punishment for it. You're not going to be accused of lying. I'm not going to look at you sideways. I'm going to be grateful for you being able to open up and bring that information to me, to know that I am a safe space for you to be open for the possibility of whatever. I've had coaches come to me in the past and say, well, I fired my clients
Oh
when
yeah, if they lie to me,
they
they're
lie to
out.
me. I had a big conversation with one person that came to one of my long morning walks when we were living in Spicewood. And they were like, I fired my client when they lie to me. And I said, well, you know, if your client's lying to you, what makes you think they're lying to you? Well, I don't care why they're lying to me. And I'm like, well, if they're lying, do you think they're safe with their information? I don't care. I'm like, well, what are you coaching them for? What are you coaching them to do? Are you coaching them to bring the greatness out of them? What is your coaching rendition? And I said, this is what a coach does to me. A coach brings out the greatness in another person. And if part of that greatness is their authentic self, I need that to come to the surface regardless of how it presents itself. And he had a snap in a place moment that was tremendous. And I mean, it was a really big snap in a place moment where I was like, if you punish people that have lied to you, they're going to become more dishonest and they're not going to trust you or other people with their information. So the thing is to, hey, listen, if you've lied to me, the work that we do, the results that you get are going to be limited because I don't have the data to support your process. Now, it may be uncomfortable for you to share. You may feel embarrassed. You may feel all sorts of things that I don't know. However, I'm here for the process. This is what we teach our condors.
Yeah.
You got to be there for the process. And when your stuff comes up around it, you got to navigate your own stuff.
Yeah.
If somebody says something to me about something they did when they were a kid that was heinous or whatever, and it brings something up for me, I got to navigate my own feelings around it. However, that doesn't mean I'm going to get in the way of this person's process. I need them to be able to be honest so that we can move through that to the other side. But if a person is withholding information from me, and we keep running into walls, there's probably a space where this person is not being vulnerable. They're not being open to possibility of me getting that information and supporting them and changing and alchemizing that information into something different.
I think that's the key point, Ta, is that a lot of times people will say they'll take lying as a betrayal, like they did this to me. And when you can shift the perspective a little bit to where are they not feeling safe? And it doesn't mean you're not hurt by someone's actions or withholds or whatever. And this is where I think that quite often people keep flipping to the polarities of things. And as you say, coming to the no-larity and the other, the gray that's not the black and white, that's really where freedom lies. Because whether it's being vulnerable or being honest, there's too much. And so someone, if they have a lot of past experiences go into one ceremony weekend, they can share in a container that's not safe. Where then, one person from the ceremony goes and shares the person's name on Instagram. Oh, I did ayahuasca with this person in Georgetown, Texas, and that person could lose their job, right? And so it's that vulnerability isn't something that you have or you don't have. It's always present. In what ways? And are you in a place to explore vulnerability for yourself where you share some of the information? Maybe it's your first time sharing things that happened in the past and you feel safest to only tell the facilitator, not the whole circle of people, and not just flipping into totally open, because that's dangerous too. And we've watched people go into psychedelics and get cracked open. Then they go into tantra, then they go into this, and they open up so many things at once that it creates a trauma response in their nervous system. At some point they hit a wall and the body shuts it down because it's like the barn doors got blown off and the windows. And, now it's like a monsoon season and you're like, oh, I wish I wouldn't have blown out, the protective mechanisms that were serving something.
Right. And the protective mechanisms that are there are individualized.
Yes.
There are people who do all kinds of wild stunts and base jumping and jumping off of cliffs and all these other things. And it's magical. And those people are oftentimes accused of being reckless and all these things, but they don't die, right? And it's like they're vulnerable to the possibility of dying. When I jumped out of an airplane at 14, was it 14?
No, it's like 10.
1,400 feet?
Yeah.
Yeah, the one in San Marcos was 1,400 feet. So we jumped out of an airplane at 1,400.
Twice.
No, one was further up. That wasn't as high. So
The one
1,400.
with Elena?
Yeah, 1,400 feet. We jumped out of an airplane, and I could have. The paperwork that they make you sign it's ridiculous.
You could die.
You could die. You might die. And if you die, you cannot hold us responsible for all. And this is a possibility.
It's a possibility.
It's a possibility.
But if you look statistically, there's a lot more things that are a far higher.
Car.
Not for me. Delete. I got 140 years on this time around.
Automobile accidents are a lot more fatal than people jumping out of airplanes with parachutes. But the thing is, if I let myself be exposed to this, but I take all the measures that I possibly can, I get my nervous system into a place where I minimize that. That's my choice. And people often feel like they don't have a choice. and they shut down as a result. They don't know how to navigate conversation. They don't know how to navigate being touched or touching. They
Yep.
don't know how to navigate these things. And so this is part of what we talk about. Radical consent for everything. Hey, is it okay if I share something with you? Right? Because I'm looking to open up and share something with you. And that opening is me letting information out. And when my information comes out, there's a possibility that you might be hurt, that you might not like it, that you will accept it, that you will love it. There's all these different possibilities.
I mean, that's a whole other podcast on radical consent,
Listen,
because I don't know that most people even know, like we will actually unpack that in a full episode, because growing up in Utah, growing up in the LDS religion, there was a time, like when I was first going to ceremonies, I remember there was two men there that became really good friends that I knew were really safe and all of that. And even still, just for one to sit on the couch next to me and hold my hand was so over the top unsafe feeling, because I was married and you don't sit by men and especially hold their hand or whatever. But even if I hadn't have been married, that was just one of the constructs that was feeling vulnerable in that moment, or possibility of hurt or harm, loss, detriment, deficit, right? Was this now creating a deficit in my connection to my ex-husband? Well, the answer is no, because nothing could create a greater deficit, but that's another story for another day. And so in those moments, it's also learning that we have to look at every construct that's feeling vulnerable. Again, it's not this, it's there or it's not there. It's in what ways is it present, and how, and what does that look like, and what do you want to do, and who do you inform, or how do you inform? Because by me to be able to articulate how uncomfortable him just holding my hand was, it wasn't because it needed to change, but I had a safe place to be vulnerable, to even just say, like, this makes me want to run. And he'd be like, say more, and it's like, that was the vulnerability necessary for me to actually be heard in that space and share how I was feeling. Intellectually, I knew I wasn't going to be harmed, but I felt all of the past situations where, even when it was a man that I trusted and that I quote unquote felt safe with, or that was a friend, that would change in an instant when no one else was around, or they'd make a move or something like that. So I did not trust that. And so intellectually, it's like, yeah, I'm safe, but in my body, all the alarms are going off. Like, I don't know, that's what so-and-so said, and that's what they said this time. And so it was through these radical consensual spaces of being able to express my vulnerability and like shine a light on them and go, wow, the impact in my body of how terrified I feel is crazy. And to have put a voice to that. And then even at times to hear, like one of the men hear me and almost not cry for me, but to get emotional and validate my feelings, or, let me know, whatever, just to be able to, that was very vulnerable for me and for them. For conversations I had over some of the situations was life-changing and life-affirming, and why I believe in this work like I do, because I could have had the same situations and circumstances of healing created, but without the psychedelic effect, without the healing capacity, without the mystical and shamanic aspects to it, it wouldn't have had the same impact, because it wasn't just the knowing of the mind. It's the way that it drops in on a cellular level into your body, which is why being so committed to this work, and why I'm so committed to it being in person. You cannot practice these techniques without people. You can learn them, you can understand them, but you have to have a safe space to practice them, to mess around and find out, fug around and find out kind of a situation with people that you can express, with people that know how to work with radical consent and back off and be with you. Because a lot of this, if you try to practice at home, bruh, and you don't have an informed consent home environment,
you don't have a dynamic.
Oh, it can get messy,
can get really
and
messy.
more traumatizing.
If it's like, if I come in and I'm like, hey, listen, I want to share something with you. Is it okay if I share something with you? And the person says yes, and I let out the floodgates, and the other person does not know that they can say, hey, listen, this is becoming a challenging space for me. They may be open now and receiving all this stuff, and all of the information I may be putting out may be an assault on this
Yeah,
person now.
exactly.
And so being able to say, hey, listen, I have some things that I want to share. I have some trepidations that this may make you feel certain ways or whatever. So I want you to know that if it becomes a lot, please just say, hey, this is becoming a bit much for me. I need to pause, or this needs to stop. This is where radical consent
Yeah.
goes in both directions. It's not radical consent for me only, it's radical consent in both directions. And so we learn how to set up boundaries. This is really important stuff. And this is what people are not talking about with radical consent. In a lot of these places is people be like, hey, can I share this? Okay, cool. And then they just let the floodgates open. And then all that information may be too much for somebody's nervous system, may overwhelm them. So how do you set up parameters? If a person starts to look a little wonky, you can stop and be like, hey, is this information still welcome? And radical consent is always subject to change in immediacy.
Yes.
Always change in immediacy. Hey, this is not feeling solid for me. You know, one of a great movie on vulnerability and alchemizing things is Everything Everywhere All at Once. Like, I highly recommend taking a look at that movie from after listening to this podcast. Go and look at that movie and look at the evolution of the character Evelyn, the mother, as she is super closed off at the beginning to hearing anything, and she starts to become more and more open to hearing things as the movie progresses. And by the time the end of the movie comes around, her husband Wayman, he's doing his best to be open the entire time and share all the time, and she's not open to it, and he wants her to hear, and he has a blockade on sharing the divorce papers and all of this other stuff. I'm not going to get into the story. You got to go watch the movie. But they start to contextualize and start to alchemize all these different possibilities by the end of the movie. It's absolutely wonderful, and it really falls into alignment with the idea of vulnerability, of a mother and daughter, of a father and daughter, of two parents together. Like, all of these different dynamics start to alchemize, and you can see a lot around boundaries, around the shifting of context and meaning, and radical consent in those spaces.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something that as much as someone reads and studies, and no matter how many programs you buy and take, experientially is the only way to truly understand
That's
it.
right.
And, I'm just going to keep drilling it in. If you haven't come to the Condor Approach live, y'all, like, now is the time, especially if you're looking to, if you know that you want to make an impact in your family's life, in your business life, if you're a coach, knowing what vulnerability flavors and textures are in your body is the greatest superpower you'll ever have, to recognize, like, oh, I'm not feeling safe. There's some part of me not feeling safe. I recognize it because I feel it here. And when it happens in this part of my body, it's because I'm not feeling heard,
Mm-hmm.
right? My voice is not feeling safe. My thoughts or my creativity is not feeling safe. And that allows me to inform my environment. If I show up somewhere and be like, hey, baby, today I'm feeling a little bit closed. I just want you to know that it's not you. I'm just a bit contracted, and just I'm in my process.
That happened yesterday.
It happens like every day at some point. That is the 2 for the hermiting, is hermit's hard sometimes. But when we can have that level of awareness and start to inform the environment, then they're not going to internalize, what did I do? Because most relationships, kids, family, for the child, if the parent is upset, that's why it's so delicate when a child is with a parent that suffered from anxiety or depression. Most of the time, the child will internalize that it was me, or if they weren't happy, it's because I didn't make them happy.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they know that the circumstances weren't their fault, they couldn't make them happy.
Mm-hmm.
And that creates a dysregulated adult where if the boss isn't satisfied, they've got anxiety. And so by having this awareness, then you can teach it to your children. When your children can start to learn this language and understanding what emotions serve, that they ultimately come to the 3 points of ease. You can see past episodes on that. You see how safety becomes the bedrock of everything.
Mm-hmm.
That is what triggers vulnerability, is because you feel vulnerable when some part isn't safe. And it's also open to a change, which means old constructs may not feel safe.
Yeah. And one of the things we teach at the Condor Approach is the roadmap to intimacy.
Yeah.
And the roadmap to intimacy starts off with tolerance, then it moves to acceptance, then it moves to safety, then vulnerability, then connection, and then intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
Vulnerability is actually high up on that space, because if you don't let information in, you don't let love in and process that information and then send information back out, then you will never have intimacy. I can be touching with people, I can have sex with people and still not be in an intimate space. And this is where, context and having context of what intimacy is, of what vulnerability is, of all these things is really important. And so if you don't have a context on intimacy, I highly recommend coming out to the Condor
Yep.
Approach. Come and see what our context is, and you can apply it to your context. This is not a law. This is a vantage point, a perspective, and a methodology.
Well, and like you just mentioned, around you can have sex with people and not intimacy. That's why people will call it emotional cheating if someone is having intimacy with someone, even if there wasn't physicality. And if you look at the roadmap to intimacy and you recognize, like, wow, my partner was having a connection with someone else, where did they not feel safe here?
Mm-hmm.
This is where it goes so much deeper than someone lied to me, someone cheated, or they betrayed. It's not that, again, people are free of consequences. We say cone sequence with sequence. There are things that happen, whether or not we meant to. What do you want to do with the information? Whether it's, I'm going to leave this relationship, but if you don't get clear, you're likely to repeat it. Or I want to stay in this relationship. How do we re-articulate it? I recognize, it's because there was a deficit in safety,
Mm-hmm.
or in their idea of themselves, or they didn't want to hurt me, or whatever. You find a different level of compassion, which can bridge the change. That's where you can grow with each other. You can really see what someone's made of when it comes to when you step into compassion. Will they show up for it too? Will they be vulnerable? That's typically where I found that I did get heartfelt apologies because I wasn't seeking them anymore. It was, I showed up to be effective in my own life because the outcome that I wanted was deeper, more honest, authentic relationships. And so I was going to model that until it was reflected back to me. And that's really where, bringing us back to where we were at the beginning of this podcast, there was the part, if I wouldn't have started already practicing that, I wouldn't have been able to do it with you. I had already been practicing to the best of my ability and taking responsibility for where I enabled in my first marriage, to where there wasn't full transparency and honesty, to where I was frustrated or dissatisfied and not communicating it effectively. I'm sure I was saying it. I am certain it wasn't being received in a way that could be effective and support and nurture growth. And so I think this is really the opportunity for anyone listening today, is to start to bring awareness to, what does vulnerability mean? And in what ways are you being vulnerable? And who are you being vulnerable with in what ways? And how? Because set and setting matters when it comes to vulnerability. If I go out into a snowstorm with no coat or boots, I am vulnerable to the cold, and I will get frostbitten toes if I stay out for too long. And so when you look at what is the set and setting of what I want to accomplish, what's the outcome that I want, reverse engineer it, make sure that you have the right equipment for where you want to get to. And if you don't have that in your communication, if you get emotionally flooded and shut down, there are skills and tools that we can teach you that will forever change all of your relationships, because it has to start with you.
Amen.